The inner workings of the heating systems created by the pioneers of the Wild West represent one of the most amazing chapters in the history of human ingenuity. Finding themselves in harsh and unfamiliar conditions, these people could not rely on ready-made solutions. They had to create their own comfort, warmth, and safety from literally nothing. Stone, as the main building material, was ubiquitous and accessible. But turning it into an effective heating system required a deep understanding of physical processes and unconventional thinking. Stone hearths, stoves, and heat circulation systems were all created intuitively, based on experience and observation. Their knowledge was passed down from family to family, from generation to generation. In this video, we will reveal the most interesting and little-known facts about how pioneers used stone to create heat in their homes. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one family came up with a system that allowed them to heat several rooms at once using just one hearth. Pioneers in the Wild West faced a problem that seems obvious, but the solution is not always obvious. This is the problem of inertia. When we think of heat, we usually imagine an open fire that warms up quickly, but also goes out quickly. At night, when everyone was asleep, the temperature in the house dropped sharply. To solve this problem, they began to use stone not only as a building material, but also as a heat accumulator. They built stoves and fireplaces that included not just a firebox, but also massive stone masonry around it. These stones heated up slowly and then slowly released the stored heat over many hours. In the morning, when the fire had long since gone out, the walls of the stove continued to radiate a soft, pleasant warmth. This allowed them to maintain a comfortable temperature in the house throughout the night without having to constantly tend to the hearth. The stone became not just a part of the structure, but an active element, functioning as a kind of heat bank. During construction, they often used local stone, which was the most readily available. This could be sandstone, granite, or basalt, depending on the region. When choosing stone, they intuitively paid attention to its density and structure. Denser rocks, such as granite, had greater heat capacity, which allowed them to accumulate more heat. The stones were laid in such a way that there were minimal gaps between them, which were then filled with clay or earth mixed with straw. This mixture served not only as a binding material, but also as additional thermal insulation. Particular attention was paid to the shape and size of the stones. Flatter and larger stones were chosen for the inner masonry, which was in direct contact with the fire. This provided a larger area of contact with the fire, and as a result, more efficient heat transfer. The outer layers could consist of smaller stones, which also accumulated heat but released it more slowly, creating a gentle and long-lasting heating effect. This two-layer system, consisting of an active core and an inert shell, was one of the key principles of their heating systems. Thus, without knowing it, the pioneers created a complex engineering system based on the principles of thermal inertia. What natural material, other than stone, do you think could be used to create a similar heat accumulator? Share your ideas in the comments. The choice between a fireplace and a stove was not just a matter of style, it was determined by the climate and the materials available. A fireplace with its open hearth was good for quick heating and created a cozy atmosphere. However, its thermal efficiency was low. Most of the heat escaped up the chimney. A stove, on the other hand, was more practical. Its closed design allowed it to retain heat and distribute it evenly throughout the room. Pioneers often combined these two approaches. For example, they built a large stone hearth that combined elements of a fireplace and a stove. It was an open firebox for cooking and quick heating, and behind it was a massive stone wall that stored heat. In this way, they obtained both instant heat and a long-term effect. In some cases, they even made special niches in the walls of the stove where they could store food that needed to be kept warm. It was a multifunctional solution, ideal for life in harsh conditions. When the pioneers built their first dwellings, they quickly realized that to survive in harsh conditions, it was not enough to simply create a source of fire. They had to use every bit of heat as efficiently as possible. They noticed that stones heated by the sun during the day continued to give off heat even after sunset. They applied this principle to their ovens. Initially, these were simple structures with the fire in the center and stones surrounding it. But over time, their engineering skills developed. They began to create complex circulation systems, directing smoke gases through channels inside the masonry before releasing them into the chimney. This allowed the stones to absorb even more heat. Some of these stoves were so massive that they took up almost half of the house. They became not just a source of heat, but a real heat accumulator capable of warming the dwelling even after the fire had completely gone out. This evolution from a simple hearth to a complex heat transfer system shows how people faced with a problem found not just a simple solution, but a brilliant one. But what if these tools could be made to work even more efficiently, even more intelligently? Let's talk about that next. This is perhaps one of the most ingenious and little-known systems invented by the pioneers. They didn't just build massive stoves, they also created a complex system of air ducts around them. These ducts were passages lined with stone that ran from the stove along the floor or even under the walls of the house. The principle of operation was simple and effective. Warm air from the stove rose, but then, instead of simply escaping to the ceiling, it was directed into these ducts. Passing through them, it heated the floor and walls, giving off heat. And then, after cooling down, it returned to the stove, creating natural circulation. Some families even built special stone benches or ledges next to the stove through which these channels passed. This way, the benches were always warm, which was especially valuable during the cold season. Creating these channels required a deep understanding of thermodynamics and intuitive engineering thinking. Pioneers used not only large stones for this, but also carefully selected flat slabs from which they formed the inner walls of the channels. The system was sealed with clay mortar, which prevented heat and smoke from escaping. They understood that even a small gap could disrupt circulation and reduce the efficiency of the entire system. This system not only ensured even heat distribution, but also solved the problem of cold floors, which was particularly relevant for houses with earthen floors or simple plank flooring. Warm air passing under the floor prevented it from freezing and made staying in the house more comfortable. It was not just heating, but a full-fledged climate control system created without electricity or complex mechanisms. Such a design demonstrated not only ingenuity, but also a deep connection between humans and the surrounding world, where every stone and every airflow could be used for good. To make stone ovens more efficient, pioneers used so-called stone cores. These were large, flat stones that were placed inside the firebox. They served as an additional heat accumulator. After the fire died down, these stones continued to radiate heat for a long time. To improve insulation and prevent heat loss, they used clay coatings. Clay was available almost everywhere, and its properties allowed them to create a dense, airtight coating that did not crack when heated. By mixing clay with straw or dry grass, they created a strong and durable material that not only retained heat inside the oven, but also protected it from external influences. The clay coating also helped to smooth out the unevenness of the stones, creating a more even and aesthetic surface. The use of clay was not limited to plastering. Pioneers often molded special shapes and tubes out of it, which they then fired in a fire or dried in the sun. These clay elements were used to create smoother and more durable channels inside the oven, as well as to form ventilation holes. This use of clay allowed them to build ovens that were not just a pile of stones, but a well-thought-out structure with clear geometry. They also discovered that adding sand or fine gravel to the clay made it more resistant to high temperatures and prevented cracking. It was a kind of primitive reinforcement. They intuitively understood that different materials react differently to heat and learned how to combine them correctly. It was not just a craft, but a true art of survival, where each element had its own purpose. The use of clay plaster also helped protect the stones from erosion, which increased the service life of the oven. It is difficult to imagine that these people, without a single physics textbook at their disposal, intuitively came to such conclusions. It was as if they found answers to the most complex questions simply by observing how the world around them worked. But what if these ideas came to them not from observation, but from something more bizarre? Say from an old cowboy joke about how the laziest pioneer ever decided to heat his house by simply sitting on a warm stone? What if everything they did was just imitating nature? Stay with us. We'll tell you all about it right now. Many stove and fireplace designs were created based on what could be called a natural principle. Pioneers did not have blueprints or manuals, but they observed nature. They saw how the sun heated the rocks on the mountain slopes and how the earth retained heat, and they transferred these principles to their homes. For example, they often built stoves with a massive base that went deep into the ground. This allowed them to use the thermal conductivity of the soil. The earth around the stove also heated up and gave off heat, creating a kind of heat buffer. This technique was especially effective in homes that were partially or completely underground, which was not uncommon for early settlers who did not yet have time to build a full-fledged wooden house. Their heating systems were part of the home's ecosystem, not a separate, isolated element. They were inextricably linked to the walls, floor, and even the ground beneath them. When building nature-inspired stoves, they also paid attention to the direction of the wind and sunlight. For example, if the house was located in an open area with strong winds, the chimney was often built on the leeward side to improve draft and prevent smoke from blowing back into the dwelling. They could also use the south side of the house to place the hearth so that the extra heat from the sun would help heat the outer wall of the stove. This was an intuitive use of passive solar energy. In addition, they created structures that mimicked natural caves. In such caves, the temperature inside remains relatively stable, regardless of external weather conditions. Pioneers tried to replicate this effect by building massive walls of stone and earth, which served as excellent thermal insulators. In some cases, they even made the entrances to their dugouts and semi-dugouts through narrow corridors to prevent cold air from entering the main living space directly. All these elements were part of a unified system where each component worked in harmony with nature. Not all stones are equally suitable for building stoves. Pioneers quickly learned to distinguish materials by their properties. For example, sandstone or limestone, although readily available, were not always the ideal choice, as they could crumble and disintegrate from high temperatures. They preferred to use dense, massive stones such as granite or basalt. These stones accumulated heat better and were more resistant to temperature changes. Sometimes they even traveled long distances to find the right material. Each stone laid in the oven had its own purpose. Large stones were used for the foundation, while smaller ones were used to fill in gaps and create a level surface. They quickly learned that stones containing a large amount of moisture or micro cracks could crack when heated. This was not only unpleasant, but also dangerous. Therefore, they preferred to collect stones from rivers or dry riverbeds, where the water had already polished and compacted them. Such stones were more durable and predictable. In addition, they paid attention to the color and texture of the stone. Dark, dense rocks were generally more resistant to high temperatures, while light and porous ones could be unreliable. But most importantly, they learned to test the strength of stones before carrying them to the construction site. They tapped one stone against another. If the sound was dull, it meant that the stone was porous and might not withstand the heat. If the sound was clear and ringing, it meant that the stone was dense and reliable. It was a kind of primitive geological research. This experience was passed down by word of mouth and became part of their cultural heritage. Thus, each stone laid in the furnace was not just a random find, but the result of careful selection and many years of experience. Just imagine how many times they made mistakes before they found the perfect material. Probably someone once brought a huge piece of stone, and it crumbled as soon as the fire was lit. I wonder how many such dummy stoves were built before they learned to distinguish the right stones. Perhaps the answer to this question is preserved in some amusing family legend passed down from generation to generation. Let's talk about this further. To make the most of the heat, some families built stoves with additional compartments. These compartments, located above or to the side of the firebox, were used to dry clothes, herbs, or even to reheat food. The temperature inside the compartment was lower than in the firebox itself, but sufficient for slow drying. This was especially convenient in rainy or snowy weather. The compartments could also be used to store food that needed to be protected from the cold. The creation of such multifunctional stoves was a response to the practical needs of everyday life. Pioneers could not afford to spend resources on separate devices for drying or storage. One design had to perform several tasks at once. Additional compartments often had separate doors, which were also made of stone or clay. This allowed the temperature inside the compartment to be regulated by opening or closing it, depending on what was inside. For drying, they used perforated stone slabs, which were laid on the bottom of the compartment. Warm air circulated freely through the holes in them, which accelerated the drying process. This was especially important for preserving crops, such as mushrooms or berries, which could spoil quickly. Sometimes these compartments were also used to heat water. Stone vessels were placed in them, which heated slowly, providing the family with warm water for hygiene needs. In some cases, particularly inventive families built hidden compartments or niches that were used to store valuable items or seeds that needed to be protected from damp and cold. These stoves were not just sources of heat, but the heart of the home, combining the functions of a kitchen, dryer, storage room, and of course, a heater. An effective heating system is impossible without a good chimney. Pioneers built chimneys out of stone, which had to be not only durable, but also properly designed. The height and diameter of the chimney directly affected the draft. If the chimney was too low, smoke could accumulate in the room. If it was too wide, heat would quickly escape outside. Through trial and error, they found the optimal proportions. Building a chimney was one of the most important stages. The stones for it were selected with particular care, as they had to withstand not only high temperatures, but also sudden changes in temperature. For the inner walls of the chimney, the pioneers often used smooth stones to prevent soot from accumulating and to improve draft. The joints between the stones were filled with a special clay mixture that could withstand high temperatures without cracking. This was critical to prevent carbon monoxide from leaking into the living quarters. In addition, they understood that the shape of the chimney mattered. Instead of simple straight pipes, they sometimes built chimneys with a slight bend or narrowing at the top. This created additional draft and helped to remove smoke more effectively. At the top of the chimney, they could install stone canopies or awnings that protected from wind and rain, but did not interfere with the escape of smoke. These were a kind of primitive deflectors that helped to maintain stable draft in any weather. The chimney was not just an outlet for smoke, but part of the house's ventilation system. It not only removed combustion products, but also created natural air circulation, which was important for maintaining a healthy microclimate in an enclosed space. Thus, the chimney was not only a safety feature, but also an important part of the overall design, ensuring comfort and well-being. Stone ovens were more than just a source of heat. They were the center of life in the home. They were used to cook food, boil water, and dry crops. In some cases, they were part of the overall structure of the house, for example, serving as supporting walls. Their multifunctionality was key to survival in conditions where every resource and every minute of time counted. This versatility was due not only to a shortage of materials, but also to the pioneers' deep understanding of energy efficiency principles. They sought to use every joule of heat generated by the fire. For example, metal boilers or cast iron pots for heating water were often built into the walls of the stove. Thus, while the stove heated the house, it simultaneously prepared hot water for domestic needs. This allowed for significant fuel savings. In addition, stoves often served as a place for cooking. Meat could be roasted or flatbread, baked on flat stones located near the firebox. The heat from the stove was used to dry firewood or clothing, which was left on special ledges or shelves. This helped to keep the house tidy and provided quick access to dry fuel. The massive structure of the stove also served as a supporting wall, holding up the roof or part of the ceiling. This saved on building materials and made the house more durable and resistant to wind and weather. Thus, the stove became not just a household appliance, but a fundamental element of the entire architecture. It was a symbol of survival and ingenuity, combining the functions of a kitchen, laundry room, storage room, and even a supporting structure. Many of these stone stoves and fireplaces have survived to this day. This speaks to the incredible quality of their construction. They were built without cement or modern mortars, but with a deep understanding of the properties of the materials. Their durability is a testament not only to craftsmanship, but also to respect for what they were creating. These structures were created not for a single year, but for generations to come. The secret to such durability lies in several key aspects. First, it was the right choice of materials. The pioneers intuitively selected stones that were resistant to high temperatures and did not deteriorate over time. Second, they used a clay mortar mixed with natural fibers, which, although primitive, was sufficiently malleable and strong to withstand temperature deformations. These furnaces were built with natural forces in mind. They were part of the landscape, not just a foreign object. Their massiveness and solid foundation, which went deep into the ground, made them resistant to soil shifts and weather events. The thermal buffer effect also protected the structure itself from sudden temperature changes, preventing cracks and destruction. As a result, these ovens are not just structures, but a legacy. They tell the story of how people, deprived of technology, found a way out of the most difficult situations, relying on observation, ingenuity, and experience. Every stone in these ovens is a part of history, a part of the long and difficult journey that the pioneers took. Their creations have become a symbol of endurance and the ability to live in harmony with nature, using its forces and resources with wisdom and respect. Today we learned how pioneer families created amazing heating systems out of stone. This is a story about how ingenuity and hard work can overcome any obstacle. We saw that stone was not just a building material, but a real heat accumulator, and that people, without technology at their disposal, created complex air circulation systems and multifunctional structures. These stoves were the heart of the home and a symbol of survival in harsh conditions. We are always looking for new topics for our videos. Perhaps you have your own ideas about what other mysteries of history are worth uncovering. Suggest your ideas in the comments, and the most interesting ones will definitely become the basis for our next episodes. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories.